You know, usually when we look at the historical profile of a political figure who becomes this massive mythic symbol for grassroots democracy, there's a very specific, almost romanticized expectation of their resume, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we expect a very particular archetype.
Right. Like, we picture dissidents who have been jailed for their beliefs, or maybe human rights lawyers working pro bono in the slums.
Exactly. Or, grassroots organizers who have spent literal decades of their lives fighting the entrenched power structure, like fighting it from the bottom up, brick by brick.
Yeah, exactly. It's that Nelson Mandela or Václav Havel model of democratic resistance, someone whose entire life story is just defined by resisting authority.
Usually at great personal cost and risk to their own life. It makes perfect sense that we expect that.
It does, because if you're going to lead a movement of the marginalized, you generally need to have walked in their shoes, or at least fought on their front lines.
Right, you need that authenticity.
But then you step into the world of Southeast Asian politics. And specifically, if we look at Thailand in the years following the 2006 military coup, that conventional romanticized profile isn't just challenged, it's completely turned upside down.
Upside down is almost an understatement. It's an impossible paradox.
Yeah, we find ourselves staring at a political landscape that is fundamentally built on these brilliant, almost impossible paradoxes. Because the figurehead of this massive street-level pro-democracy movement—
A movement fueled largely by farmers and the urban working class, I should add.
Right, exactly. The figurehead of that movement was none other than a billionaire telecommunications CEO and a former prime minister.
Yeah. It's wild to think about. And not just a billionaire capitalist, but a man who, during his actual time in power, had an undeniably authoritarian track record.
Oh, absolutely undeniably. We are talking about a leader who centralized state power to an unprecedented degree. He openly clashed with the press. And, he oversaw a notoriously brutal war on drugs in 2003 that resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings.
Right. And he was frequently and harshly criticized by the exact same human rights activists and leftist intellectuals who would, just a few years later, be marching in the streets under his banner.
Which is just, it's mind-blowing. So how does that metamorphosis actually happen? How does a billionaire with a distinctly authoritarian past somehow get washed clean and transform into the ultimate untouchable symbol for a liberal democracy movement?
That metamorphosis and the actual mechanics behind how a crowd adopts and shapes a leader is the central mystery we are unpacking today.
Welcome to our deep dive. And this particular deep dive, which is episode 3 of our ongoing Reading CA series exploring the undercurrents of Southeast Asia, is tailored specifically for you.
Yes, you, the political science student listening right now.
Exactly. We are going to bypass the basic overviews and get straight into the heavy machinery of political theory, social movements, and comparative politics. We're using a truly brilliant piece of academic literature by Michael K. Connors.
It's titled Beyond the Leader: An Ideational Political Logic's Approach to Redshirt Movement Populism in Thailand.
Such a good paper. It is essentially a masterclass in dissecting the anatomy of a political uprising.
Before we jump into the streets of Bangkok, though, we should probably put a quick pin in something crucial.
Oh, yes. The ground rules.
Right. We are looking at some heavy, highly polarizing, real-world political trauma here. The source material covers deep conflicts involving both left-wing and right-wing elements in Thailand.
Yeah, we're talking intense anti-establishment protests, the royalist establishment, military crackdowns, and just a lot of lingering national pain.
Exactly. And so we want to make it explicitly clear. We aren't here to pick sides. We aren't here to endorse a political viewpoint. And we certainly aren't here to validate the morality or the rhetoric of either the Redshirt movement or the anti-Thaksin establishment.
Beautifully said. We are strictly putting on our political mechanic hats to look at how the engine works. We're looking at the how and the why of the machinery, not judging the destination.
Right, just analyzing the mechanics as presented in the source material.
So our trajectory today is to first arm you with 2 major theoretical lenses used to study populism. We have to build that toolkit first.
Yep, the theories are essential.
Then we are going to take those abstract theories and watch them explode into reality. We'll see how the Thai Redshirt movement adopted Thaksin Shinawatra, and we'll dissect the incredibly sophisticated media ecosystem, the myth-making, and the raw collective emotion that sustained an entire resistance.
To start building that toolkit, we have to address the word populism itself. Because, I mean, in mainstream media, it has been stripped of almost all its analytical value.
Oh, it really has. The word populist is thrown around so loosely now. Like if a politician promises lower taxes, a pundit calls it populist. If a leader criticizes a newspaper, they're labeled a populist.
Right. It's basically just become an adjective that means, a popular political strategy that I happen to disagree with.
Which is incredibly frustrating for political scientists, because in academia, populism has very specific, rigorous definitions.
It does. And Connor's paper focuses on two distinct, dominant academic approaches to understanding this phenomenon. The first is what we call the ideational approach.
And that one has been most famously championed by the political scientist Cas Mudde, right?
Exactly, Cas Mudde.
Okay, let's work through Mudde's approach. If he's calling it ideational, I have to assume he means this is less about the material realities, like, Marxist class warfare or raw economics, and more about the actual realm of ideas, like the ideology itself.
You're hitting the nail on the head. Mudde views populism fundamentally as what he calls a thin-centered ideology.
Thing-centered.
Yeah. It doesn't have the comprehensive world-building depth of a thick ideology like socialism or fascism. Instead, it's a very specific ideational framework that views society as being ultimately separated into two homogeneous and totally antagonistic groups.
Okay, so a strict binary.
Right. On one side, you have the pure people, and on the other side, you have the corrupt elite.
Wow. Okay, so it's deeply moralistic. It's not just saying, like, the elite have more capital than the working class.
Oh, not at all.
It's saying the elite are fundamentally corrupt and evil, and the masses are fundamentally pure and good. Good versus evil. Pure versus corrupt.
Exactly. And that moral binary leads to the core goal of ideational populism, which is the argument that politics should be nothing more than the direct expression of the volonté générale.
The general will of the people, taking it all the way back to Rousseau.
Yes, exactly. The populist leader claims to have a total monopoly on interpreting and executing that general will.
Okay, so if we use Mudde's lens, we are essentially looking for a set of specific ideational attributes.
Right. We ask questions like, does the leader constantly talk about a corrupt elite? Do they flatter the masses as pure?
Do they claim that their policies are the sole expression of the homogeneous will of the nation?
Exactly. And this is the lens most Western scholars have traditionally used to analyze Thaksin Shinawatra. They listen to his speeches, they look at his populist policies, and they ask, does he fit this ideological profile?
Which makes sense as a starting point. But the author of our source material, Connors, argues that if we just look at the leader-like, if we just treat populism as a checklist of a politician's speeches, we miss the actual mechanics of the movement.
It's way too leader-centric.
Right, which is where the second theoretical lens comes in, the political logics approach, developed by Ernesto Laclau.
Yes, Laclau's approach is vital here.
And according to the paper, Laclau provides a more parsimonious ontological framework. Wait, let me pause there. Parsimonious, ontological. Let's break that down, because those are heavy academic hitters for our Populism listeners.
Yeah, let's definitely unpack the jargon. When we say Laclau's approach is ontological, we mean he is looking at the very nature of being or existence of the political group.
Okay.
He is not just looking at what the people are demanding, like the ideas or the policies. He is looking at how a collective entity, known as the popular subject, actually comes into existence in the first place.
Oh, I see. How does a scattered, disconnected population suddenly transform into the people with a capital P?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's the ontological part.
Okay, that clarifies ontological. It's the study of how the group is born. And parsimonious.
Parsimonious means it is the simplest, most efficient explanation possible. Laclau doesn't rely on, complex assumptions about human nature or a pre-existing pure class.
Right. He doesn't need all the moral baggage.
Exactly. He strips it down to its most basic structural mechanics.
So Laclau doesn't care if the people are pure or if the elite are corrupt. He just cares about the physics of how the crowd forms. Because the people doesn't just exist naturally in the wild, right?
Of course not.
Like if you walk down the street in Bangkok or anywhere really, you don't see the people. You see individuals. You see a farmer who is struggling with crop debt.
Right.
You see a university student who is angry about censorship laws. You see a small business owner frustrated by zoning regulations. They're just individuals with completely different problems.
Laclau calls those individual unfulfilled problems differential demands.
Differential demands. Okay.
Yeah. In a normal, functioning hegemonic system, the institutions of the state try to manage or absorb these differential demands one by one.
We're putting out small fires.
Exactly. The government offers a subsidy to the farmer. It tweaks the zoning law for the business owner. By satisfying, or at least managing these demands individually, the system keeps them separate. They remain differential.
But the catalyst for populism happens when the system fails, right? When the state cannot or just will not absorb those demands over a sustained period of time.
That is the exact trigger. When a variety of these differential demands are repeatedly frustrated by the same system, a profound shift occurs. A new political logic emerges.
Okay, so what happens to the people in that shift?
Well, the farmer, the student, and the business owner suddenly realize that while their specific desires are completely different, the source of their frustration is identical.
It's the state.
Right. So these random, disconnected demands start to link together. Laclau terms this linkage an equivalential chain.
I really love that term, equivalential chain, because it perfectly describes the mechanism. The student fighting censorship and the farmer fighting for crop prices realize they are fighting the same entrenched elite.
Yes. Their demands become equivalent purely in their shared opposition to the system.
And the moment that equivalential chain is forged, the structural geometry of society changes, doesn't it?
It does. It creates what Laclau calls an internal frontier. You no longer have a pluralistic society with various competing interest groups. You have a hard, unyielding line dividing the social space into two distinct camps.
You have an ontological rupture. You have an us and a them.
Exactly.
Okay, so if I'm synthesizing this from my politional brain, Mudd is giving us a photograph of what populism looks like from the outside. He captures the rhetoric, the ideology of us versus them, the moral language.
Right, the still image.
But Laclau is giving us the raw video footage of the chemistry. He shows us the physics of how these disparate atoms bump into each other, link arms, and become a single, unified, breathing organism.
That is a phenomenal synthesis. The photograph of the ideology versus the video of the political logic. And what Connors does in this paper, which is his true analytical breakthrough, is twinning these two theories.
Twinning them. Like using them both at once.
Exactly. He argues that if you want to truly understand the Redshirt movement in Thailand, you cannot just use one. You need Laclau to understand how this massive populist subject was physically forged after the 2006 coup.
But you also need Mudd to map the specific moral ideational content they use to sustain that internal frontier.
Yes. You need both the structure and the ideas.
But this raises a massive logistical problem. If you have all these frustrated groups, the farmers, the students, the urban poor, suddenly linking arms to form this equivalential chain, how do you actually bind them together long term?
It's incredibly difficult.
Right. Because shared anger is incredibly volatile. It burns out, or people start arguing over the specifics of their individual demands. You need an anchor. You need something to stand in for the whole movement.
And that necessity brings us to one of Laclau's most fascinating and sometimes misunderstood concepts, the empty signifier.
The empty signifier. Okay, let's get into this.
For an equivalential chain to hold its shape, there must be a symbol that exemplifies the unity of all these different competing demands. The empty signifier is an element. It can be a word, a flag, or very often a person that stands in for the entire chain.
Let me puzzle out the word empty here, because intuitively, calling a leader an empty signifier sounds like an insult. You know?
It does sound like a critique, yeah.
It sounds like you are saying the politician is vapid, hollow, or just has no real substance. But in Laclau's physics, I'm guessing empty means something closer to drained of specifics.
You're exactly on track. It is not a moral judgment at all. It is a structural necessity. The signifier must be empty because it has to be deliberately emptied of its actual specific reality, its particularity.
Why is that necessary?
Think about it strategically. If the symbol or the leader is too specific, like if they only represent the highly technical demands of the agricultural sector, the university students will feel alienated and leave the chain.
Oh, I see. So the leader has to be emptied of highly specific policy details so that they can instead signify a broader mythic fullness.
A mythic fullness, precisely. They transition from being a politician with a white paper to becoming an aspirational horizon for the people.
They become a vessel.
Yes. To say a leader is an empty signifier is not to say they are meaningless. It is quite the opposite. The leader becomes overloaded with a surplus of meaning and collective emotion. They carry a symbolic weight that no single human being could ever actually bear in reality. The person is transcended by the social enactment they represent.
And here is where we take the theory and drop it right into the streets of Bangkok. Because the source material argues that following the military coup in September 2006, Thaksin Shinawatra became this exact textbook empty signifier for the resulting pro-democracy movement, which we know as the Redshirts.
To contextualize this, the Redshirt movement, which was formally organized as the United Front for Democracy Against Dictatorship, or the UDD, was not a monolith initially.
Right, it was a bunch of different groups.
Yeah, it formed out of various disparate anti-coup groups throughout 2007. You had rural populists, urban intellectuals, hardcore leftists, and disenfranchised business owners. They had highly diverse, differential demands.
But their overarching unifying goal was the restoration of an electoral democracy.
Exactly. And Thaksin, who was ousted and forced into exile, became the perfect, hollowed-out symbol of that thwarted democracy.
There is an incredibly striking visual from the source material that captures this mechanism perfectly. In December 2007, right before a post-coup general election, there was a pro-Thaksin newspaper called Mahaprakashan.
Which translates to the great people.
Right, the great people. They published a front-page image that featured Thaksin superimposed over a crossroads sign, and the headline literally read, "All roads to Thaksin."
All roads to Thaksin. I mean, you couldn't ask for a more literal visual representation of localized theory.
It's perfect.
He is the crossroads. He is the singular point where all the differential demands of the people intersect and merge into one unified direction.
What's even more telling is the subtitle of that newspaper. It read, 23rd December 2007, A Coup by the People. They weren't just campaigning to re-elect a specific man to a specific office, were they?
No, not at all. They were using the election to reverse a historical injustice.
Which points to the deep, almost spiritual collective emotion involved here. In the articulatory practice of the Redshirt movement, Thaksin losing his political office was conceptually perfectly translated into the people losing their democracy.
The two concepts became totally fused. An attack on Thaksin's legitimacy was an attack on the sovereignty of the Thai voter.
We really need to dig into the grassroots reality of this emotion, because it's so easy to look at this from a high academic tower and see it just as like structural manipulation from the top down.
Right, but the emotion was incredibly genuine for the people in the provinces.
Exactly. The deep dive explores a specific story from the aftermath of the brutal 2010 military crackdown on the Redshirt protests. A newspaper reporter traveled to the northeast of Thailand, which is the rural heartland of Thaksin's electoral support, and interviewed a watermelon vendor.
This is a crucial anecdote because it cuts through the cynical narratives often spun by the establishment to dismiss the movement.
Yeah, the elite narrative was always that these rural protesters were just ignorant or that they were literally being paid to protest. But the reporter finds this watermelon vendor who is actively selling what he calls Redshirt watermelons.
Redshirt watermelon.
Yeah. He has meticulously made his own red flags, his own posters. He is deeply invested. And the vendor says, and I'm paraphrasing the quote from the source here, he says, "I am a redshirt. I didn't get money from anyone to do this. I do it because I like Thaksin with my heart."
With his heart.
Right. He goes on to say he had good policies. He said he would solve poverty in 3 months, and he did. There was the Village Fund, the OTOP stimulus program, free education. And then the vendor delivers the most devastating, important line.
What did he say?
He says, "I liked these not because of money, but because you could take him at his word."
Because you could take him at his word.
Yeah.
That sentence is just profound.
It really is.
It completely dismantles the establishment's argument that this was just transactional clientelism.
Which is the old patron-client network where a local boss just hands out cash for votes, right?
Exactly. But this wasn't about a handout. It was about dignity. Thaksin, through his massive socioeconomic policies like the universal health care scheme and the million-baht village funds, had delivered on a social contract.
He actually delivered.
He centralized the discretionary budgets. He cut through the traditional sluggish bureaucracy that treated the rural poor like afterthoughts. And he created a direct, unmediated line of gratitude.
He treated them like active citizens who deserved a functioning state rather than subjects who should just be, grateful for whatever scraps fell from Bangkok. He gave them political agency.
He did.
So this deeply individual gratitude from millions of people, like the watermelon vendor, begins to morph. It scales up into a massive collective democratic fervor. And Thaksin becomes the ultimate vessel for all of it.
The empty signifier.
Right. If Thaksin is the empty signifier, he is essentially acting like a political black hole. He is generating such immense gravitational pull that he sucks in all these different desires.
Everything gets pulled in.
Whether you want better rural health care or a new constitution, or you just feel historically ignored and disrespected by the elites, all those incredibly complex, nuanced desires get sucked into chanting one single word at a rally. Thaksin.
His name literally becomes a placeholder for justice. As one scholar noted in the Connors paper, when the crowds were shouting, "Thaksin, come back," at these massive rallies, it wasn't just a literal logistical plea for the men to board a plane and return to Bangkok.
What was it then?
It was a symbolic, performative statement demanding the reinstitution of social justice, economic opportunity, and political inclusion. The particularity of Thaksin, his flaws, his billionaire status, the uncomfortable reality of the man himself, is totally suspended by the crowd.
Suspended in favor of the myth.
Yes, he sleepwalks into becoming a mythic figure.
But Leclerc's political logic tells us that an equivalential chain and an empty signifier aren't enough on their own, right? The logic requires a frontier. It requires a tangible enemy.
You cannot forge the identity of the people without an elite to fight against.
The black hole needs something to consume. So who are the red shirts actually fighting?
This is where we see Connors beautifully weaving Chasma's ideational approach back into the analysis. We need Mudd's framework to understand how the Redshirts constructed the corrupt elite to contrast with their pure people.
Right, the moral binary.
The Redshirt movement adopted a highly sophisticated, deeply resonant demotic language to define this internal frontier. They proudly adopted the label of Frey.
Frey, which translates roughly to serf, or commoner, or peasant, doesn't it?
Yes, historically it refers to the indentured commoners in the traditional Thai feudal system. And they position their enemy across the frontier as the Amat. The Amat translates to the elite, the aristocracy, or the entrenched bureaucratic polity. This Frey versus Anat dichotomy became the absolute defining narrative, the ideological engine of the movement.
We have to unpack the cultural weight of this linguistic choice. Because by calling themselves Frey, the protesters weren't throwing a pity party. It wasn't a plea for sympathy.
Not at all.
It was a sarcastic, aggressive, almost weaponized flaunting of their supposedly low status. It was a way to actively mock the pieties, the forced deference, and the condescension of the establishment. They were taking a historical insult and forging it into armor.
It was a marker of second-class citizenship, but worn proudly on headbands, banners, and T-shirts. And by doing so, they forged a direct historical break.
A break with what?
They were reaching all the way back to the unresolved tensions of Thailand's 1932 revolution, the revolution that ended the absolute monarchy. By identifying as Frey, they were explicitly naming the political culture of deference that had historically excluded ordinary people from real power.
Wow, and they visually demarcated this frontier by wearing red. Initially, back in 2007, red was just a color used by various groups to oppose the military-backed constitution.
Right, just a protest color.
But it rapidly consolidated into a totalizing identity. It distinguished them from the yellow-shirted establishment protesters who had originally mobilized to oust Thaksin before the coup.
The contrast was striking.
The visual of a sea of red shirts occupying a street, contrasting with the memory of the yellow shirts, is the literal physical manifestation of Leclerc's internal frontier. It's a color-coded ontological rupture.
And we really have to look at how the intellectual cadre of the Redshirts defined the Ahmad. Because it wasn't just a vague, generalized feeling of economic inequality. The leadership was incredibly strategic about expanding the target.
Which brings us to a fascinating figure mentioned in the text, Jakrafop Penkare.
Yes, Jakrafop.
He was Thaksin's former spokesperson and a key intellectual architect within the movement. In the source material, Jakrafop states that his proudest achievement in 4 years of political struggle was getting the masses to target the Amat as the main enemy, rather than just relying on the abstract word dictatorship.
That distinction is vital, because in previous Thai pro-democracy movements, such as the major uprisings in 1973 or 1992, the target was usually quite obvious, the military dictatorship of the day.
The guys with the guns.
Right. But Jakrafop and the Redshirt intellectuals argued that the military was just the muscle. The generals were just the enforcers. The real enemy was the what Jakrafop termed the government within the government.
The government within the government. I see where he's going with this. He argued that the real lasting power in the kingdom wasn't the elected parliament, which could be overthrown at any moment by a coup. The government within the government was the permanent establishment. The high-ranking civil servants, the military officers embedded deeply in the patronage system, the conservative courts, the independent state agencies, and the privy councilors.
The network that never leaves.
Right. The Redshirts argued that this unelected elite network hovered over the nominal government and constantly conspired to thwart the will of the people whenever an election didn't produce the result they wanted.
By naming and targeting the Amat, the movement established a frontier of permanent vigilance. They weren't just fighting a single military coup or a single prime minister. They were declaring war on an entrenched, multi-generational oligarchy that they believed was existentially incompatible with electoral democracy.
And this wasn't just a war of words or abstract concepts, was it?
No, it's very physical.
The Redshirts took this newly formed identity, this mobilized general will, and they actively, physically occupied historical and geographical space. The most dramatic, visceral example of this happened during the massive, paralyzing protests in the spring of 2010.
A huge moment.
The protesters moved from the old historical quarters and set up their main fortified camp in central Bangkok, right in the absolute heart of the high society luxury shopping district.
A district known as Racha Prasan, which translates to Royal Wish.
Right. Royal Wish. And in this brilliant stroke of linguistic and spatial rebellion, the Redshirts literally renamed the intersection. They called it Ratsadon Praison, People's Wish.
People's Wish. It's incredibly poetic.
Jakrafat Penkare even wrote a poem about appropriating this untouchable middle-class heaven and turning it into a gritty monument of the common people. They were literally overwriting the pristine geography of the elite with the sweaty, demanding geography of the fray.
And they didn't stop at physical geography. They appropriated historical time as well.
How so?
The Connors paper details how during those same tense 2010 protests, the movement boldly co-opted Chakri Day. Chakri Day is a deeply significant, solemn, royal holiday commemorating the founding of the current ruling dynasty.
That is a bold move. And what did the Redshirts do with it?
A pro-movement newspaper published a massive front-page photo of the swarming crowd of protesters with the headline, Chakri Day, we cannot be dispersed.
The audacity of that framing is incredible.
It really is. They weren't explicitly rejecting the monarchy as an institution. Rather, the mainstream movement was attempting to aggressively negotiate a new relationship with it.
Redefining their place.
Right. The bottom banner on that same newspaper read, "This home loves the king, treasures democracy, and resists dictatorship in every form." They were rhetorically maneuvering to claim that they, the fray, who were sleeping on the streets demanding a democratic constitution, were the true, loyal protectors of the nation.
Rather than the elites who hid behind the palace to orchestrate coups.
Exactly.
So if we look at this through Mudd's lens of the general will, the Redshirts had evolved far beyond just protesting for better crop prices or a change in cabinet ministers.
Far beyond it.
By calling themselves fray, by defining the Amat, by physically renaming city intersections and co-opting the national mythology of holidays, they were literally claiming to be the constituent power of the nation.
Yes.
They were no longer petitioning the state. They were saying, we are the state. We are the sovereign.
Yes. They were positing themselves as the direct historical heirs to the 1932 revolution. They viewed the people as a sovereign, unstoppable entity whose general will had been repeatedly thwarted for 8 decades.
And this realization leads to a profound, almost terrifying sense of historical immortality among the protesters, doesn't it?
It does. There's a tiny pamphlet distributed during the 2010 rallies mentioned in the paper, and it contains this chilling, powerful slogan, "You cannot kill the population. You cannot eradicate them all."
You cannot kill the population. That is the ultimate untouchable assertion of the populist subject.
It is.
It's saying that even if you send the military in, even if you shoot the protesters and clear the intersection, the concept of the people survives the bullets. It's incredibly powerful.
Very powerful.
But, and this is a massive but, that forces us to confront the darkest complexities of this story. There is an enormous elephant in the room, a pragmatic paradox that we absolutely have to address if we are analyzing this honestly.
Yes, the paradox of the authoritarian populace.
Right. We totally understand why the grassroots rural voters loved Thaksin. He gave them healthcare, he gave them village funds, he gave them a sense of dignity. We get the watermelon vendors' logic.
It makes complete economic and social sense for them.
But the source material makes it abundantly clear that the Redshirt movement was also guided, especially in its crucial early days of formation, by hardcore leftists.
Yes, organic intellectuals, former communist insurgents from the 1970s, and veteran rights activists.
People who possess a deep, rigorous theoretical critique of both rapacious capitalism and state authoritarianism.
Exactly. These are people who have spent their lives reading Marx and fighting dictators.
So how on earth did these people consciously align themselves with Thaksin Shinawatra? Let's just remind ourselves of the grim reality of Thaksin as prime minister. He wasn't a socialist man of the people.
No, far from it.
He was a billionaire capitalist who enriched his own telecommunications empire. He aggressively centralized power around his own office. And most alarmingly, he had a genuinely horrific authoritarian track record.
We can't gloss over that.
Under his direct leadership in 2003, there was a highly controversial war on drugs. This wasn't just tough policing. It resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings in the streets.
A massive human rights violation.
And then in 2004, there was the Talk Bai incident in the Deep South. Over 80 unarmed protesters died, the vast majority of them suffocating to death after being stacked like literal cordwood in the back of military transport trucks by security forces under his government's command.
From any objective human rights perspective, his premiership was deeply problematic. It was stained by severe violence and a disregard for due process.
So how does a veteran human rights commissioner look at that bloody record and say, yes, this billionaire who oversaw Talk Bai is the man we will follow to achieve a pure, liberal democracy?
It's a huge contradiction.
How do the leftist intellectuals rationalize handing the keys of a mass democratic movement over to him?
They rationalized it through an intense, almost ruthless, and deeply uncomfortable pragmatism.
Pragmatism, okay.
The leftist cadre within the Redshirts recognized Thaksin's flaws perfectly well. They weren't blind to his human rights record. But they also recognized their own historical weakness.
What was their weakness?
For decades, these intellectuals had the right theory. They had the structural critique, they had the moral high ground. But they lacked the one thing they desperately needed to actually force change in the country.
An instrument of mass mobilization?
Exactly. They lacked a genuine, visceral connection to the millions of grassroots voters.
And Thaksin, for all his flaws, had that connection. He held the loyalty of the millions.
Precisely. They saw Thaksin not as a moral savior, but as a historical instrument. A blunt object, a battering ram, if you will, designed to smash through the gates of the conservative establishment.
Let's look at how they justified this cognitive dissonance out loud, because the quotes in the paper are staggering. The author quotes Jaran Ditapachai.
Jaran is a key example.
Jaran was a former human rights commissioner who had actually been highly critical of Thaksin's rights record during the war on drugs and Talk Bai. Yet, Jaran paradoxically argued that despite all of that bloodshed, Thaksin's government was the most democratic Thailand had ever experienced.
Which sounds completely contradictory.
Why? Because, as Jaran stated, it was the only government that made the people know what the meaning of politics is.
That is a breathtaking statement from a human rights advocate.
It really is.
Jaran is essentially arguing that the political awakening Thaksin triggered the mass realization among the rural poor that their votes could actually dictate state policy, that the state could serve them, was so profoundly, structurally democratic that it historically outweighed the authoritarian violence of his actual governance.
It's the idea that Thaksin broke a deeply ingrained psychological spell. Jakrafat Penkare touched on this specific psychology too, didn't he?
He did, yes.
He noted that before Thaksin's socioeconomic policies, many poor Thais, influenced by traditional interpretations of Buddhism promoted by the state, believed they were poor because of their karma. They believed they were simply suffering the consequences of past lives.
Which is a very convenient belief system for the ruling elite.
Exactly. But Thaksin's policies showed them that their poverty was political, not spiritual. It was a structural failure that could be fixed by a responsive state.
Jakrafop's own justification for serving Thaksin is equally fascinating and reveals this intense pragmatism. He explicitly stated in interviews, "I do not see Thaksin as an angel. I see him as the right leader for this moment."
The right leader for this moment.
Yes. Jakrafop viewed Thailand as a country that had been intentionally kept backwards, treated by the paternalistic royalist state as a child slave.
A child slave.
The conservative elite viewed the masses as uneducated children who needed to be guided and disciplined by virtuous, unelected, good people.
Jakrafop argued that Thaksin was the brutal, necessary agent of modernization capable of breaking the country out of that infantilizing system. He even went so far as to compare Thaksin to Priti Panamyong.
Priti Panamyong, that's a huge comparison.
For context for our listeners, Priti is the highly revered, idealistic civilian leader of the 1932 revolution who tried to implement democracy. But Priti was an idealist and ultimately a failed politician who was exiled.
Right.
Jakrafop essentially said he was tired of noble failures. He wanted to work for a successful politician no matter how flawed, who could finally revive and execute those thwarted 1932 aspirations.
Thaksin, representing new capital and aggressive globalization, was seen as the inevitable, unstoppable weapon against the stagnant old aristocracy.
Listening to this, it's like the leftist activists thought they were hiring a powerful battering ram to knock down the elite's fortress door. But once the door broke open, they looked around and realized the battering ram was actually driving the getaway car.
That's a great way to put it.
They desperately needed his mass appeal to form the equivalential chain, but the cost of using him was accepting his absolute unyielding control over the movement's image, resources, and ultimate strategy.
And the intellectuals were acutely aware of the danger of this bargain.
They weren't blind to it.
No. The source material notes that the editorial team of Thai Red News, one of the key movement publications, explicitly warned about the peril of tying a massive pro-democracy movement entirely to the fate of one single man.
What did they suggest instead?
They argued passionately that the struggle should be fundamentally about democratic principles, about the Constitution, about electoral integrity, not just a personalized campaign to bring Thaksin home and return his confiscated billions.
But the logic of Leclau's empty signifier is simply too strong to resist. The masses couldn't and wouldn't separate the abstract struggle for democracy from the visceral struggle for Thaksin.
They're completely intertwined.
To the watermelon vendor, abstract democratic theory meant nothing. Democracy was Thaksin.
Ultimately, as the political lines hardened and the establishment forces clamped down violently on the protests, the leftist cadre essentially had to dissolve themselves completely into the empty signifier.
They had no choice.
The intellectuals had no financial or organizational choice but to rely on Thaksin and his well-funded proxy parties. Those parties eventually centralized total control of the UDD leadership. The ideologues had to surrender the steering wheel to the billionaire to keep the movement's engine running.
Which brings us to the final fascinating piece of the puzzle, the logistics of maintaining a myth from afar.
Right, because he wasn't even there.
Thaksin was overthrown in 2006. He fled the country to avoid facing corruption charges, which he claimed were politically motivated. He is living in self-imposed exile, physically absent from Thailand.
He's in Dubai, he's in Hong Kong, he's in London.
Exactly. So how do you keep a massive street-level political movement alive? How do you keep the emotional temperature of millions of people at an absolute boiling point when your empty signifier isn't even in the same time zone?
You do it through the meticulous construction of a highly sophisticated, ubiquitous media ecosystem.
Ah, the media.
When the leader cannot be physically present to shake hands and kiss babies, you have to industrially manufacture an unmediated sense of intimacy.
The pro-Thaksin media apparatus was nothing short of incredible. You had major publications like Thai Red News. You had hundreds of localized grassroots community radio stations sprouting up in every single province, broadcasting directly to the villages.
It was a massive network.
And you even had slick broadcast television programs like Truth Today, which actually aired on state-run public TV during the brief windows when pro-Thaksin proxy parties managed to win elections and hold the government before being dissolved by the courts.
And this vast media apparatus had a very strict dual mandate. First, it had to constantly craft, update, and reinforce the heroic narrative of the exiled leader.
And the second mandate?
Second, it had to relentlessly, aggressively demonize the elite enemy to ensure that Leclau's internal frontier never softened. Let's look at the crafting of the hero first.
The imagery used to keep Thaksin present in the minds of the fray was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He became this omnipotent spectral presence.
The ghost in the machine.
Yes. The Redshirt media was completely awash with his image, but it was carefully curated to evoke very specific shifting emotions depending on what the movement needed that week.
They played dress-up with him?
They literally did. There were photos of him wearing a Mao cap, deliberately portraying him as a gritty, revolutionary leader of the agrarian people. Then in the next issue, there were photos of him in casual golf wear, looking like a relaxed, successful modernizer.
Or he'd be in formal white civil service uniforms, projecting legitimate state authority.
Whatever the specific image, the overarching goal was to imprint his permanent, undeniable presence on the national psyche. They had to make the voters feel like he was watching over them.
And they played heavily on creating an emotional, familial bond. During his long exile, Thaksin would periodically send handwritten postcards that the Redshirt media would gleefully reproduce on their front pages.
The postcards are such a brilliant touch. One of the examples highlighted in the source is a postcard featuring his handwriting scrawled across a photo saying, "I will never forget the great generosity of my brother and sister Redshirts."
So personal.
There were these gentle, melancholic messages of homesickness. It created a feeling of profound, almost gleeful intimacy. Here is a billionaire, a former prime minister, a man who used to fly in private jets, writing to the impoverished fray and calling them his brothers and sisters.
There was a specific anecdote in Connor's paper that perfectly encapsulates how this manufactured intimacy actually altered his persona.
Tell us about that.
The Thai reporter traveled to visit Thaksin while he was living in exile in Hong Kong. The reporter had a moment of hesitation, wondering what kind of gift you possibly bring to a billionaire fugitive.
What do you buy the man who has everything?
Exactly. He decided to bring DVDs of the Redshirt protests that were currently raging back in Bangkok so Thaksin could hear the crowds chanting his name.
It's the perfect, surreal feedback loop. The leader sits in a luxury hotel in Hong Kong watching the people protesting for him, while the people in Bangkok protest because they know the leader is watching them on a DVD.
It's incredible. And the reporter in that Hong Kong interview noted a profound, almost magical shift in Thaksin's aura.
What changed?
He marveled at how Thaksin's dramatic fall from grace, his status as a hunted fugitive pursued by the courts, had actually stripped away his intimidating elite aura. The reporter noted that Thaksin had transformed from boss to everyone's older brother, from Joe Nai to Phi Chai.
From boss to older brother. The irony there is impossibly rich. By launching a coup and overthrowing him, the military establishment actually completed his transformation into a true populist icon.
They did his PR work for him.
They martyred his political career, which allowed him to shed his billionaire baggage and become one of the victimized, hunted people.
But the media ecosystem couldn't just survive on warm, fuzzy feelings and postcards from Hong Kong. It had to tear the Amat down.
Right, the second mandate.
To maintain localized political frontier, you have to constantly remind the people why they are sleeping on the hot asphalt of Bangkok. You have to hyper-villainize the elite.
And they accomplish this largely through incredibly aggressive whataboutery, which is a classic, highly effective populist rhetorical strategy.
Extremely effective.
When the establishment media constantly accused Thaksin of corruption, and to be clear, he did have numerous severe corruption and conflict of interest cases winding through the courts, the Redshirt media deflected this by aggressively investigating, exposing, and amplifying the corruption and double standards of the supposedly virtuous, unelected elite.
The strategy was simple. If the courts are against us, let's prove to the people that the courts are corrupt. If the generals claim they are protecting the nation, let's expose the generals stealing from the nation.
The source material highlights some incredibly striking examples of this media warfare. They specifically targeted General Suryat.
Oh, General Suryat.
General Suryat was a highly respected privy councillor, and crucially, he was the man the military installed as prime minister right after the 2006 coup to project stability and morality.
He was a man who deliberately presented himself as a figure of unimpeachable moral virtue, a classic stoic good person of the traditional establishment.
Right. And the Redshirt investigative apparatus exposed the fact that General Suryat had allegedly illegally encroached on protected national forest land to build his sprawling private estate in Khao Yai.
The hypocrisy was glaring.
The television show Truth Today blasted this revelation across the national airwaves with a devastating, unforgettable headline, "Amat, eat the forest."
Amat, eat the forest. It is brilliant, lethal framing. It completely shatters the moral supremacy of the elite.
It really does.
The UDD leadership explicitly pointed out the staggering double standard on their broadcast stages, noting that if an ordinary dark-skinned provincial farmer had encroached on even a fraction of that same protected forest to grow crops, they would already be rotting in a provincial jail.
But the general gets an estate.
Exactly.
And the rhetoric only escalated from there, especially after the military violently cracked down on the protests, resulting in nearly 100 deaths in 2010. The media dropped all pretense of civility.
It got very dark.
They began regularly referring to the elite establishment as beasts from hell who hide behind their virtuous, smiling personas. They even ran fake vigilante advertisements in their newspaper.
The vigilante ads were shocking.
They mocked a right-wing royalist group by printing the actual mugshots of eminent establishment figures, privy councillors, former prime ministers, high-ranking judges, and bluntly labeled them the rubbish of the nation.
The text of that fake vigilante ad urged the fray. If you see them anywhere, collect them. Do not let them steal democracy.
Wow.
They were deliberately defining the frontier as an apocalyptic battle between the democratic masses and a network of criminal, inhuman, hypocritical oligarchs.
So synthesizing this, the media isn't just reporting the daily news. They are actively, intentionally scripting a mythology of war. And this brings me back to the mechanics of localized theory. Analytically speaking, how vital is this aggressive, polarizing, highly toxic media scripting to actually sustaining localized internal frontier? Like, could a movement like this have survived on the positive message of "we want democracy" without the hyper-villainization of the elite?
Analytically, the hypervillainization was absolutely essential for survival.
Essential.
Without this constant aggressive media framing, without the daily relentless drumbeat of the Amatet are corrupt beasts to balance Thaksin as our loving brother, the equivalential chain would have inevitably fractured under its own internal contradictions.
Because it was too fragile.
Remember, this movement was an incredibly fragile alliance made up of indebted farmers, radical leftists, urban students, and pragmatic business people. Their underlying daily demands were entirely different.
Right, they all wanted different things on a Tuesday morning.
Exactly. If the media hadn't constantly pointed to a shared, terrifying existential enemy, the natural friction between those groups would have caused the chain to snap. The movement would have dissolved back into a disparate group of people with unrelated grievances.
The media was the intense heat of the forge that kept the chain unified.
Perfectly said, yes.
We have covered immense ground today, so let's pull all these threads together. We started with the theoretical blueprints. We took Kasmud's ideational approach, understanding the moral ideology of the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and the claim to the general will.
And we interlocked it with Ernesto Laclau's parsimonious political logic.
Right, the physics of how unfulfilled differential demands link together to form an equivalential chain, creating an unyielding internal frontier.
And then we took those abstract academic theories and watched them play out with startling, violent clarity in the history of Thailand. We saw how diverse grievances against an entrenched elite establishment formed a unified chain of resistance.
We saw how Thaksin Shinawatra, a billionaire CEO with a deeply flawed, bloody human rights record, was systematically emptied of his authoritarian past to become the pure, flawless, empty signifier of thwarted democracy.
It's an incredible transformation.
We watched the grassroots adopt the historical identity of the fray to wage a geographic, linguistic, and media war against the Amat.
Connor's paper provides a perfect, multifaceted case study in how a populist subject is constructed, sustained, and mobilized.
But as we always do, we want to leave you with a final, profound paradox to mull over as you close your notebooks. Something that the conclusion of the source material grapples with, and something that should keep any serious political science student awake at night.
It is a theoretical contradiction that strikes at the very heart of how we understand political progress. By its very definition, Mudd's ideational populism is deeply anti-pluralist.
Anti-pluralist.
It relies entirely on an us versus them mentality. It claims that there is only one homogeneous general will, which logically leaves absolutely no room for legitimate political opposition, minority dissent, or compromise. The logic of populism is inherently illiberal.
Yet the Redshirts, this massive, awe-inspiring movement driven by the polarizing zero-sum friend versus enemy logic of populism, used this exact illiberal mechanism to demand the restoration of a liberal democratic constitution.
They use the sledgehammer tools of populism to fight for the delicate rules of liberalism.
And that is the ultimate paradox. Can you actually achieve a pluralistic, tolerant, liberal system using a mechanism that fundamentally relies on demonizing your political opponents as beasts from hell?
It's a question without an easy answer.
I want you to really think about that. Can a movement driven by the polarizing zero-sum physics of populism actually be the vehicle that restores a tolerant democracy? Can you use a battering ram to build a house?
That's a perfect analogy.
Or does the very nature of a populist rupture, the creation of that bitter, unyielding internal frontier, fundamentally poison the democratic destination you arrive at, even if you win the election? That is a question political science is still desperately trying to answer, not just in the context of Thailand, but globally as we watch populism rise in established democracies around the world.
It forces us to confront a terrifying question. Do the means inevitably corrupt the ends? Or is sometimes, in the face of an entrenched, undemocratic elite, a violent populist rupture the only tool capable of shattering the glass ceiling of an oligarchy?
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this exploration into the mechanics of Southeast Asian politics has given you some sharp new theoretical tools to view the world with. We will be back soon with more deconstructions of history, power, and movements. Until then, remember, in the world of politics, whenever you see a perfectly clean, unified crowd, You might want to ask who built the machine that brought them together.